And welcome to our third lecture in the series on the archaeology of the Western Hemisphere. As I mentioned last time, we're missing an important lecture on what is happening in the Amazon basin by Professor Heckenberger, and I will endeavor to have him give a solo talk in one of our Wonders series next spring or perhaps next fall. So I'm very pleased today to introduce Dr. Whittaker Schroder, assistant professor in the UF Department of Anthropology. And he's also affiliate faculty member of the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience. That institute was established by Florida State in response to the threats of sea level rise and storm intensification due to global warming. Under the aegis of that institute, Dr. Schroder is working with communities in Florida, Ecuador, and Italy. I'd love to hear more about that sometime. Professor Schroder is also a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Cultural Heritage Center. Dr. Schroder got his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, although he's a native-born Californian. And at UF, he is an affiliate faculty with the Center for Latin American Studies and the Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. He's obviously a very busy man. His research is primarily landscape archaeology to understand past settlement systems, agricultural intensification, and fortification. And on that little cheat sheet that I distributed, the first lecture, I identified landscape archaeology as one of the subdisciplines. Basically, Dr. Schroder is interested in how individuals and communities create and shape their landscapes to address short-term and long-term socioeconomic risks. In that research, he works extensively with remote sensing technology such as LiDAR. He is currently directing the Lower La Cantun archaeological project in Chiapas, Mexico, just north of the Guatemalan border. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Schroder.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm looking forward to talking about the Maya and sharing some of my research that Phyllis mentioned I do in Chiapas, Mexico. It's a great little cheat sheet here that Phyllis gave you all, and as she said, I certainly do most of my research in the area of landscape archaeology. One of the interesting things about working with the Maya is that, in a way, Maya archaeology is partly prehistoric and partly historic. And it's one of the rare opportunities we have as archaeologists in the Americas and the Western Hemisphere to study historic archaeology in a Native American context, because the Maya had such a complex writing system that recorded their histories. I'll also be talking today about how we're using new technologies to reveal Maya settlements and Maya archaeological sites, and how that's changing the way we understand the Maya and changing the way that we do archaeology in Mexico and Central America, as well as really any rainforest, densely forested environment where we can use these technologies to map landscapes beneath the forest canopy. So one of the questions today that I want to talk about is, what do we mean when we talk about the Maya? Archaeologists often like to group what we're seeing in the archaeological record into what we call archaeological cultures. So we want to define a culture based on their geography, where they resided. We want to understand archaeological cultures in terms of the technology that they used, in terms of the material culture, the artifacts that they left behind, the art styles, the languages that they spoke. And so we tried to reconstruct these archaeological cultures. It can be a little bit difficult with the Maya because we know that the Maya are still with us. There are still millions of Maya people living in Mexico and Central America, and now there's a large diaspora around the world. So when we're talking about the Maya, we want to try to understand what we can learn from the archaeological record, but also what we can learn from modern Maya people today about their own histories. And we can also use the writing system and the written records that the Maya left behind to really bolster and shed light on the archaeology that we have access to. And we do have many written records by the Maya. Many of the famous records are what are called codices, and these are essentially sort of pamphlets. They sort of fold into a sort of accordion shape, and they're made out of bark paper. We unfortunately only have 4 of these that have survived. Now, many of these books, unfortunately, were intentionally destroyed by Spanish conquistadors, and other codices, any sort of paper artifact, was also long destroyed just by the natural processes of rot and of decay that take place in these rainforest environments. But we also have many records of the Maya that were left behind on more permanent sources, on stone, for example. And so many of the written records that we have from the Maya were placed at archaeological sites, at important ritual centers, political centers, where kings and queens would document their histories and their dynasties in a very permanent, solid form in stone. And so we are able to interpret those remains to understand one aspect of the Maya, but we also have to understand that that type of media, of stone media, is a very specific type of writing. It's always political. It's always focused on the most elite members of the society. So we are missing a large portion of Maya history that probably was recorded on paper previously. Now, we can also look at how our way of practicing archaeology has changed in the region. We, of course, have wonderful chronicles from explorers like John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, who were among the first non-Maya people to visit the region and to really document the archaeological heritage deep in the jungle, deep in the forest. And we have these amazing drawings by Frederick Catherwood that are actually fairly accurate for the time and are very useful to us today. We also have archaeologists like Tatiana Proskuryakov, who sort of continued this important legacy of architectural drawing to document archaeological resources, including this drawing that she made of the site of Piedras Negras in Guatemala. And today we have new technologies that are transforming how we do archaeological research in the region, and particularly a technology that I use is called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. And so this is essentially a form of laser scanning that can be done from the air, and essentially from an airplane or a drone, we're able to send these laser beams or light pulses down to the ground. And this light bounces off of everything, right? It bounces off of the trees, it bounces off of the canopy, and eventually that light reaches the ground and it bounces off of the ground. And we can actually record how long it takes that light to return to the sensor on the airplane. And using that and the speed of light, we can do all the calculations. The computer does it all mostly, but can calculate the distance between the airplane and the surface of the Earth. And so we can use that and all of these data points that we get to reconstruct images and maps of the ground and of the archaeological landscape, which is very useful to us. So many of my students, when I'm talking about the Maya, many of them have some familiarity with Cancun. Many of them go to Cancun to travel. They go on spring break. So this is a very common trip that many of my students do. And I always encourage my students, if they are going to go to Cancun, which is a very accessible place, to be sure that they take some time to go visit some of the archaeological sites in the region. Has anyone traveled, had the opportunity to travel in any of these areas in the Maya world? Well, great, that's amazing. So the Yucatan Peninsula, I assume, and that sort of area. Has anyone been to either of these 2 sites, Chichen Itza or Tulum? So these are the 2 of the most heavily visited archaeological sites in Mexico, mostly because of their proximity to Cancun. Tulum may be the most heavily visited archaeological site in Mexico. Teotihuacan is another one closer to Mexico City, which kind of vies for the the most heavily visited archaeological site. And Chichen Itza, of course, is a very well-known site. And these are fairly accessible sites. But to really understand the Maya, it's great to really go deeper into the rainforest. And has anyone been to either of these sites, Tikal? El Mirador? Has anyone been to El Mirador? Really? Oh, great. So El Mirador is a little bit more difficult to get to. Tikal is probably the largest Maya archaeological site. It's located in Guatemala, and it was actually the first archaeological site in the world that was established by UNESCO as a cultural and natural park. So the first biosphere that was created to protect natural and cultural resources. El Mirador is another site. This is a little bit to the north of Tikal. It's also in Guatemala. This one is a little bit much harder to get to, really. You either have to take a helicopter or walk there, are really the only two ways to get there. So I'm going to talk today. It's a short time, but what I'm going to try to do is talk about Maya history, starting from the origins of Maya civilization. And I'm probably going to get maybe up to here. I think is the best approach here. So this is the way that we divide up Maya history as archaeologists. We talk about the origins of Maya civilization in what we call the pre-classic period. And then the classic period is really this fluorescence of what we consider the Maya civilization to have accomplished. This is where we have the largest archaeological sites, where we have the writing system at its highest level of complexity, art styles, the most complex political systems in place by this time. And then, of course, afterwards, we have the very well-known Maya collapse that takes place right around this time. And we have a resurgence of Maya culture after the collapse into the post-classic period. The Maya area is very diverse, so it's important to keep in mind the entire Yucatan Peninsula here is made up of many different environments and many different aspects of Maya culture. The northern lowlands in particular is fairly dry, whereas the southern lowlands is a true rainforest environment. And then in the highlands here, we get very high altitudes. And with these different environments, we have very different manifestations of Maya culture. So the origins of Maya culture have often been linked to a group of people who are today known as the Olmec. And Olmec was a term that the Aztec civilization actually used to talk about the people who inhabited this portion of the Gulf Coast of Mexico. So kind of the Big Bend here of the Gulf of Mexico. And Olmec means the rubber people. And so during the period of the Aztec Empire, roughly around the 14th, 15th centuries, the people who inhabited this part of the Gulf of Mexico were known as the Olmec. Now, we use the term Olmec to talk about a civilization much older than the Aztec Empire. This civilization is really interesting because we see some of the first elements of what we would consider Mesoamerican civilization to have been. So when we think of Mesoamerican civilization, we think of things like the calendar, the very elaborate calendar that most civilizations in Mesoamerica used in some way. We do think about rubber, the invention of rubber and the use of rubber in sports like the ball game, where rubber balls were passed back and forth, sort of like volleyball or tennis was probably the way it was played. And we see certain elements of the worldview and the cosmovision of Mesoamerican cultures starting to emerge with the Olmec. And we see pretty clear evidence of the first royalty and the first leaders of civilizations in the Olmec region. Most famous from the colossal Olmec heads that have been discovered, this in particular at a site called San Lorenzo. So there's these three large Olmec centers that are well studied and well known: San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. And probably the most intriguing aspect of Olmec heritage is their art style, which is unique in that we see these sorts of downturned lips. We see these interesting features. Sometimes they are lacking teeth. Sometimes if they do have teeth, they just have sort of fangs or canines. And we often see, sometimes they look like they're sort of crying. Often they look like babies even, in this case, sort of like crying babies. And they often have this sort of what's called a cleft, just the kind of niche that's carved out of the top of their heads. And so there've been some interesting interpretations of this art style. It's possible that royalty, the Olmec kings, were referencing the shape of a jaguar skull. And we can see here, this is a throne that a ruler would have sat on. And we have the jaguar imagery at the top here. And we have that same sort of cleft in the top with the fangs displayed there over the image of the ruler here. And so it suggested that maybe the rulers associating themselves with a jaguar. And why would a ruler want to be associated with a jaguar? It's the most powerful animal in the environment, really. And we also see here a ruler seems to have some sort of rope, and it's attached to individuals on the sides of the throne here. It's possible we're seeing some image here associated with captive taking, which becomes very common with civilizations later on with the Maya. We also see jade artifacts, this important association with this green stone, sometimes bluish green sort of stone that was the most important precious stone for the Olmec and for the Maya after them. And much of this kind of imagery has been called the were-jaguar imagery, and this is sort of like a werewolf, right? So it's a transformational kind of being. It's a human jaguar sort of hybrid. And so that's kind of one of the explanations for what we're seeing in the art style. I just have a golden retriever here because you can kind of see that shape of the skull has that kind of cleft in it. Jaguars have the same thing, but it's a little bit easier to see on a golden retriever. So the big question is, what was the relationship between the Olmec and the Maya? So for the longest time, archaeologists considered the Olmec to have been a quote, mother culture for all of Mesoamerica, meaning that the Olmec have the first signs of civilization. They have the first sign of major settlements. They have the first pyramids. We know that pyramids become very important in Mesoamerica. They had the first urban centers. They had the first use of the calendar. So all of these really important attributes of Mesoamerican culture we start to see with the Olmec. So for the longest time, archaeologists would refer to the Olmec as a mother culture. But the reason for this was because there hadn't been as much research in the Maya area. So all of the oldest evidence was from the Olmec area, from that Gulf Coast region of Mexico. As we've done more and more work in the rainforest environment of the Yucatan Peninsula, we found older evidence of the Maya. So we can now see that perhaps the Maya may be better thought of as a sister culture to the Olmec. So they sort of came about together and influenced each other. There's still a bit of debate here, right? So it's not a completely resolved question, but we're starting to see much older evidence for the Maya than we had known of previously. But I do think that there was a certain view by the Maya themselves to think of the Olmec as their ancestors, to think of the Olmec as being the origin of some aspects of their culture. This is one example here. This is a type of pendant or a gorget, probably worn on the pectoral region. And this was an Olmec object. So I don't think it's securely dated, but we could say that it's probably around the period of 1000 BC or so, more or less. And we have that traditional Olmec imagery of the fangs, the downturned lips, the cleft in the head here. So very typical Olmec imagery. But if you turn it over, you can see on the back that many years later, in fact, over 1000 years later, someone came and inscribed Maya imagery on the back. And we know that this is early classic period. So this is probably around 6th century AD, so many years later. Somebody came along and reused this important royal imagery for the Olmec and sort of reused it to match their own conception of the world. So I do think that there is certainly some truth to the Olmec being, to a degree, a type of ancestral culture to the Maya. So some of the earlier evidence that we've started to see with the Maya, since the Olmecs were first investigated, we're starting to see along the Pacific coast of Mexico and Guatemala, all along here, we're starting to see earlier and earlier sites that have Maya imagery, or that have imagery that seems to be the origin of much Maya imagery. And this is a very important center called Itzapa, one of the oldest sites on the Pacific coast. And in this area, we're starting to really see people we would consider to have been Maya in some way. They may have spoken Mayan languages, or they may have spoken similar languages to the Maya, but we're starting to see aspects of their artwork really emerge in terms of Maya iconography. This is also one of the sites that was first mapped with LiDAR, with this laser scanning technology. So you can kind of see the original kind of sketch map here, probably using a compass, using tape measures, using total stations, mapped pretty much by hand. And then we take the technology here, and it can be mounted on an airplane and flown above the landscape, and we get this kind of topographical data here. But you can see even the older maps are very accurate still. This just gives us kind of a more holistic perspective on what a site like this might look like. These pre-classic sites from this period tend to have this really linear kind of settlement patterns, where they are clearly on an axis, usually north to south, or just off of north to south, just east of north to south. So that's something that we see. And when we see a type of settlement pattern like that, it typically means that it's an older settlement. This is some of that imagery. These are some line drawings of some of the monuments at Itzapa. And Itzapa is one of the first sites where we see what we call the stela altar cult. And we use the term cult just to refer to a sort of belief system in this case. And so this would be a stela where we have a stone that is upright, and then we have the altar in front of it, which is a stone, usually circular, that's on the ground at ground level. And typically the whole point of the altar would be to leave some type of offering to the image of the stela. And this is something that we see with the Maya later on. It's also really interesting. We start to see aspects of the Maya creation story shown here. We know that a lot of this imagery is associated with some ideas of Maya religion later on. In particular, we have here some image showing two individuals fighting what looks to be some type of bird. It actually looks like a deity of some kind. Oops. Some kind of deity. You can see the face of a human or a deity, and then they're wearing like a mask of a bird, and they have the wings here. So this is actually a bird that's descending. And then we have these two individuals here, seem to be fighting the bird in some way. And we have a fruit tree here that we can identify as what's called a nance tree. It's a type of fruit from the region. And we have other images of these kind of descending birds. We have an image here showing probably one of these individuals, and he's actually missing his arm. This is how they're showing blood sort of dripping out. So it seems that he's lost his arm somehow in the battle here. But he's now seems to have tamed the bird somehow. He now has the bird up on this kind of staff. And then we have all this imagery here of vegetation, and it seems to be some type of crocodile, some type of image associated with the earth and with a world tree of a sacred tree here. And we see these types of sacred trees throughout Maya history. We know that this particular fruit was sacred to the Maya many centuries after this. So much of this story seems to be told much later on in what's called the Popol Vuh. Many of you may have heard of the Popol Vuh. This is a written document that was discovered around the 18th century. And it was actually written in Latin script. So it's written in the Quiche Mayan language, but written in Latin script. But it's recording the Quiche, which is an ethnic group of Maya from Guatemala, and it's recording their creation story. But there's aspects of this creation story that we can trace very far back into the archaeological record, including at Itzapa. We have here some images, for example. This is from a ceramic vase that probably dates to around the 7th century AD or so much later than Itzapa. But we're seeing some type of image here of one of these individuals sort of fighting against what seems to be one of these bird deities again. And we have in the Popol Vuh a story where these two individuals, who are called the hero twins, fight against what's called a demon bird. And one of these hero twins loses his arm in the battle. So it's clearly some type of reference. And remember that this is like an 18th century AD story. But we can trace this all the way back to perhaps 1000 BC. So there's some real time depth to these stories. We also see in the Pacific coast at other sites, this is a site called Chiapa de Corzo, where we see early examples of Maya royal burials. And again, we're not totally sure what language these people may have spoken. It's possible they spoke a Mayan language. It's possible they spoke another language. They probably were bilingual. They probably spoke several languages, in fact. But we do see some similarities to what we see later on with the Maya. And in particular, we have the earliest royal burial tomb in Mesoamerica. And it was in this type of architecture that we call an E group today. And so this is the E group here. The tomb was excavated here. And this is essentially a large pyramid. This is the pyramid here. And then on the eastern side of that pyramid, we have a long structure. Oops, keep doing that. We have a long structure. And that's what the E group is. We have other E groups throughout the Maya area. This is an E group at a site called Washaktun, which is also an old site during this pre-classic period. And this was actually the first place where this type of architecture was first identified. We have the pyramid here, which had these masks on it of this bird deity, actually the same bird deity we see at Itzapa. And from this pyramid, standing on top of this pyramid, which is where this photo was taken from, you can look out and see these three smaller temples on a long platform. So it's that same type of architecture. And this has been associated perhaps with the solstice and the equinox events. So there seems to be some type of astronomical association for this type of architecture. These are some more examples. So we now, of course, have LiDAR, and we're able to see many more of these all over the Yucatan Peninsula. And again, the critical element is that large pyramid on the western side and that longer structure on the eastern side. So these are all different variations of that same type of E group architecture here. Hopefully you all can see that. And they're almost always oriented north-south, or again, just slightly off of that axis. There was a recent discovery using LiDAR at a site called Aguada Phoenix, and some of you may have seen this in the news a few years ago. This was a site that had not previously been identified, but archaeologists were able to identify this using LiDAR data. This is what the site looks like from above. It looks sort of natural, like it's just sort of the natural topography. But when you actually use the LiDAR, which is what we're seeing here, we can make out all of these details, that it's not just a natural hill, it's actually a rectangular construction. This is all earthen architecture, so it's all made out of dirt and clay, essentially. And this is one of the largest archaeological sites known in Mexico. And until maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't known at all. This platform here is about 1 kilometer long from here to here. And we have in the middle one of these E groups. So that's the sort of pyramid on the west and then the long structure on the east. And then surrounding that, we have all of these features. It's really just a massive site. Probably the largest Maya archaeological site ever discovered. And until about 10 years ago, it was completely unknown. And what the archaeologists identified, again, using LiDAR, is they identified that really large example, which again, very large, but looking around the area, they were able to identify the exact same pattern, that sort of rectangular elevated platform with one of those E groups in the middle, just not quite as big. So they vary. They could be very small. They could be 50 meters long, or they could be up to 1 kilometer long, right? Which is the largest one. But they were able to identify them, and you can see they're all at that same sort of angle. So there's certainly some type of astronomical significance here. The archaeologists also looked at San Lorenzo, which again is one of those Olmec sites. And they were able to look at the LiDAR and see that San Lorenzo might have had a very similar design. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. In fact, you can see the kind of rectangular form there. And you can see these are ramps here. So these seems that was a way of getting up on top of the platform. We have similar sorts of ramps here. And then if you look around, there's 20 mounds surrounding the rectangle. And not to get into it in too much detail, but Maya cultures used a base 20 numbering system. They didn't use base 10 like we do. They used base 20. So there may be some significance that there's 20 mounds around. and there seem to be 20 structures around this as well. So there's a lot of similarity between San Lorenzo and Aguada Phoenix. And so this may actually be that link between the Olmec and the Maya to finally resolve that question, who came first, right? Or what was the nature of that relationship between the Olmec and the Maya? We also see, just like some of those Olmec sites like La Venta, we see that very significant association with jade and greenstone in these offerings left in different architectural phases. We do see some sculpture. So far, there hasn't been as much sculpture documented at Aguada Phoenix as we see among the Olmec, but they're really only just starting to excavate there. So other archaeologists, in fact, actually the same archaeologists who discovered Aguada Phoenix, had for many years worked at a site called Ceibal, which is, if you can see here, it's more in that central part of the Maya area. So we've been looking at La Venta, the Pacific coast. Aguada Phoenix is sort of up in here. So this is really in the heartland of the Maya area. So this is getting to where we know people would have spoken Mayan languages. And they identified this site, Ceibal, which also seems to have a very old history, certainly back to 500 BC, maybe to 900 BC or so. So this pushed Maya history further back in the heartland area of the Maya. And this also was a site that was reoccupied much later in what we call the Classic period. So much of what we're seeing here is actually architecture that was built over the old architecture. But within that settlement, you can see there's another one of these types of E groups here, buried by that later architecture. And we find the same sort of greenstone artifacts, the Olmec style artwork. So clearly some kind of link here between the Olmec area and the Maya area. We also have other types of architecture that have been identified in LiDAR. These are the largest Maya constructions known from the pre-classic period. They're called triadic groups. So they're essentially pyramids, but they're kind of fractal, if that makes sense. And if the more you zoom in on them, the more detail you get. So they're called triadic groups because they have a large pyramid and they have two smaller pyramids with an open area. And there is some variation, right? So some of them have more mounds than that, but they all have those three structures, which makes them the triadic group. But if you zoom in even more, it might be a little hard to see. There's a triadic group on top of the triadic group. So there's 1, 2, 3 there. And it's sort of fractal in that way where you keep zooming in and you start seeing more and more triadic groups within triadic groups. But these are huge constructions, the largest pyramids known in the Maya area. Very well known at El Mirador. The largest structures at El Mirador are all triadic groups. And this is a 3D image showing the large triadic group here. Again, kind of on top of a triadic group in a way. And this again is LiDAR. This all came out recently, the LiDAR mapping of El Mirador, which is also one of these very old sites in the pre-classic period. We also start to see organization of some of these sites. For the longest time, Maya archaeological sites were never thought of as planned or as planned in the way that we might think of city planning today, right? Where it's, for example, here in Gainesville, we're mostly on a grid layout. We don't really see that so much with the Maya. It seems like it was sort of more organically built, sort of built over time without any sort of long-term city planning. At least that was the perspective in the past. But with the LiDAR, we're starting to see more patterns emerging. We know that, for example, in Mesoamerica, that certain sites were built on a grid. Teotihuacan is a very well-known example that was built on a grid. Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital, now Mexico City, was built on a grid as well. But we didn't see that so much with the Maya. But we've started to see that more with the LiDAR as well. This is a site called Nixtun Chich, which is in the northern part of Guatemala, right up on the Lake Petén Itzá here. And we see some form of a grid here, which is not, at least as far as we know, not as common among the Maya. And there's even a suggestion, this might go a little bit too far, but some people have suggested that it's actually a crocodile or a gator maybe going into the lake. And I mean, you can kind of see it, but it might be a bit of a stretch. Depends how you feel that day. Some days I look at this and I believe it. Some days I think, well, that's a little bit of a stretch. That's right. So much of my interest is not only in the settlements and the urbanism and the city planning of the Maya, but also in their landscape. So we're looking not just at the largest sites that they constructed, but also at the way that they managed their landscapes, how they planted their crops, how they intensified their agriculture to support large populations. And some archaeologists have called the Maya approach to archaeology, or sorry, the Maya approach to agriculture as a managed mosaic, meaning that they utilized several different agricultural techniques that they kind of blended together. And so the most common form of agriculture that's still practiced today is known as milpa agriculture, or sometimes slash and burn or swidden agriculture. This is where you choose a plot of land and you burn down the forest, and that sort of creates the biochar that will provide the nutrients for your crop. But you can only plant there for a few years before you have to move to a new, to clear a new space of land and let that other, ideally let the other land grow back, which of course works with smaller populations, but is a little bit less sustainable, quite a bit less sustainable when you have really large populations. But that's still practiced today on a small scale with some Maya communities. There's other forms of intensifying agriculture using terraces, and this is something you'll probably see with later talks, especially about Peru. The degree of agricultural terracing there is at a scale that we frankly don't really see with the Maya, but we do see a degree of terracing with the Maya, where they are planting on slopes, which is minimizing erosion. It's also kind of capturing the drainage, the water that flows down the slope to intensify agriculture. Of course, in the highland areas where we have volcanoes, we have very rich soils. Also in the river valleys, we have very rich soils, but most of the Maya area is not blessed with that type of environment. We also have, at least among the Aztecs, we have what they called chinampa agriculture, which directly translates as floating garden. Now, they're of course not literally floating. What they're doing is that they dig out these canals and they pile the fill into these mounds in these raised sections, and they plant on top of these raised sections, and they paddle their canoes through the canals. This is a part of Mexico City called Xochimilco, which you can go see. But we do see some aspect of raised field or chinampa agriculture among the Maya as well. A lot of this type of agriculture was identified in the 70s. So many Maya archaeologists didn't think that the Maya had any type of agriculture besides that swidden slash and burn agriculture. But Billy Lee Turner, a geographer, identified these types of terraced systems and walled, almost like showing the extent of these plots of land that people or families might have owned, and showing them from the air, taking photos from the air. And this was a new view of Maya agriculture at the time. Today with LiDAR, we can see much more of that. So this is the same type of sort of, again, kind of gridded or walled kind of compounds that were probably used for agricultural purposes. Also at a site called Caracol in Belize, which is, again, one of these early archaeological sites that was mapped using LiDAR. This was kind of a trial run for LiDAR that worked, that succeeded, and led to the boom in LiDAR research that we see today. And so at Caracol, I don't know if you can see it so much, but these kinds of contours along the hillsides, those are all these agricultural terraces. And so we see probably the largest scale agricultural terracing in the Maya area at this site of Caracol, alongside, again, one of these triadic groups, if you remember there. So another one of my interests is the political systems of the Maya, and we can best study the political systems using the historical record that we have. And we have access to the historical record in some places really starting around the 4th century AD or so, where we start to get these written records. There certainly was writing before that, but it's much harder to decipher. It's a different writing system. There's not as much of it that we can actually use to translate the texts. But this is when we have access to the written record that we can read, at least. And there have been several models to understand Maya political systems, but the kind of enduring political model right now is that we had these two large centers, political centers, during the Classic period. They reached their height right around the 7th century AD to 8th century AD. Tikal being one of them, which again is probably the largest archaeological site in the Maya area, which has now been mapped with LiDAR as well, shown here. And then the other large center is in Mexico called Calakmul. This site has also been mapped with LiDAR, but I don't have access to the imagery. I've seen it, but I don't actually have access to it. So we're starting to gradually see more and more of the landscape being mapped with LiDAR. So these two sites we know were the largest political forces during the Classic period, and they were enemies for much of their history. And they fought many battles against each other. And we have actually the names of their dynasties here in the glyphs here. So this, when we see this glyph, we know that that's Tikal. And when we see this glyph, we know it's Calakmul. So that's one of the ways that we can actually reconstruct the political history of these settlements. And we know that the social structure of the Maya was centered mostly on what is called the ahau. And ahau is actually a Mayan term that's still used today in the Yucatan, and it basically means Mr. or Sir. And in the past, we know that it referred more to a ruler or lord. If you want to do an analogy with sort of medieval Europe, this is essentially the lord is really where that analogy comes from, in a sort of feudal system. So we do have a ruler. We also do have female ahau as well. They're not always male, but we have the ahau, and we actually have different hierarchies of ahau as well. So we have the lord. We also have the holy lord. We also have the first lord in the land, and so we have all these different titles. So ahau is sort of the ruler, but we can have different hierarchies even within rulers. And then we have what is often called the royal court, where we have the noble people. We have, of course, the princes and the princesses. We have the bureaucrats. We have the military generals. We have the local governors. We have all access to all of that. Perhaps other elite members of society, the artisans, perhaps. As we get further down, oops, I keep doing that. As we get further down, we get the farmers, right? We get the servants, possibly slaves as well at times. So we have access to much of this system of this political system in the artwork of the Maya Classic period. And this, of course, Phyllis was talking to me about this, is at Bonampak, where we have these beautiful murals that are preserved, and we have some of the best insight into the structure of Maya society at this time. These paintings were dedicated around the end of the 8th century AD, probably about 795 or so, right at the end. And we have all of these important individuals being shown. This happens to be, what we're seeing is the site of Bonampak was allied with another site that we call Yaxchilan. So we're seeing the rulers of these two sites. And then we're seeing all of the musicians. They have maracas. We see performers, people with trumpets back here. So this is a celebration. And then up here, we have all of the visiting dignitaries. So these particular people here are all from sites nearby that are allied with Bonampak and Yaxchilan. These are the captions here that name each of these people. They never finished the captions. They actually never finished these paintings. This happened right around the time that we call the collapse. So they actually never finished this, but they planned on filling in these captions here. And one of these individuals, this one here, actually, I'll get to in the last few minutes here. The site that I'm working at, this individual comes from the site where I work. So it's really nice to actually see the face of somebody who was at the site where I'm working now. We see a group of women here on a throne, probably the queen and some other members of the royal elite. So this is the celebration, but what are they celebrating? So if we go to this room, we can actually see what they're celebrating, that this is a battle, and it's a very vivid battle. This is the actual painting, and this is basically like a rollout. It's the same sort of thing here. So the shape of the roof it's sort of angled like that, right? So this is if you folded out the rooms. So really the paintings are surrounding you, right? If that makes sense. So this is the wall, and then these are the ceilings here. It's sort of angled parts of the ceilings. And that's the same thing you're seeing here. These are reconstructions of the paintings because the paintings are kind of incomplete and faded in places. But this gives you a sense of what the battle would have looked like. This is the king. He's capturing somebody by the hair. This individual is on the ground here. There's all these people. The battles would have been really chaotic. They would have been probably fairly small scale, but they certainly would have been devastating and chaotic. We have what seems to be some type of costumed person or a deity of some kind. They probably went into battle with their patron deities, with images of their deities. Over here, we have the captives being shown. We have this individual, again, the king. We have the people here kind of begging for their lives here. We even have some people like a decapitated head there. You can even see some people had their fingernails removed. So very graphic stuff. And we actually suspect that the people here are from a site that's called Saksi. So Saksi is another site in this region that was an enemy of Bonampak for a time. So one of the questions was, where is Saksi? Because we often have the names of these cities or the names of these sites, but we don't always know where they were exactly. So these are kind of the major archaeological sites in the area that I work, which is all sort of this area here in Chiapas, Mexico, on the border with Guatemala. We have here, I think many of you are probably familiar with Palenque, very well-known site. Piedras Negras is another site. This is a painting here. Piedras Negras is still in the jungle, basically. So you can visit it, but you need to take a boat. It's very hard to get to. So there aren't any really good photos of Piedras Negras. So that's just a painting by Tatiana Proskuryakov. And then these are a couple other sites, Tonina and Yaxchilan. So these were kind of the four large-scale political entities or kingdoms during the classic period. And they did not always get along. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, just like anywhere else. But the question was, what about Saksi? So Saksi was sort of a fifth major player in the region based on what we could read in the inscriptions, but nobody really knew where it was. And so I had the opportunity to visit a Maya speaker, a modern Maya individual in the town of Lacanha Saltal, which is sort of north of Bonampak. And he showed me this inscription that he found on his land that shows a well-known ruler of Saksi. His name is Kabchante. And he's shown here in a dancing pose, and he's wielding an axe. There's very likely another person down here who isn't shown. It's broken. So it's fragmentary, but this was enough to say that we were dealing with Saksi. This was a funerary monument for this individual, Kabchante. So certainly marking his tomb at this site, Lacanha Saltal, which was Saksi in the past. And we've used LiDAR. This was drone LiDAR. So much of the LiDAR I've shown you is from an airplane. This is from a drone. You can put the LiDAR apparatus on any sort of, you could even put it on a car. You could put it on a tripod, but it has to have a certain type of range, right, to work. So this was mounted on a drone. And the thing with the drone is we're not able to map such large landscapes. We're only able to map site level details. So this is the site here. All these black dots are different features, different structures. And then this is the main center of the site here. So all of this, I was also working on that aspect of the archaeology in the region while I was working on my dissertation, which was at a fortified center. So we have this evidence for warfare between kingdoms and this evidence for the politics and how the politics shifted over time. And so I was working at this site that was sort of on the outskirts of that Piedras Negras site. And so trying to understand how Piedras Negras would have protected its boundaries, what role outlying communities would have had in these episodes of warfare. And so I worked at a site that appears to have been a fortified settlement that was built on top of this large hilltop. It actually had defensive walls down here and then up on top of the hill as well. And then just being on this kind of inaccessible hilltop location contributed as well. And I was able to map the site. I didn't have LiDAR at the time. This was maybe a decade ago now. So I mapped the site using a total station here, which is you have if you ever see people, surveyors outside, mapping particular infrastructure within the city here, this is the type of equipment they use. So I would take essentially every sort of point. I would have somebody with a stick with a prism, who you can see down here, and I would get a signal from the total station to the prism and back. So I would do point by point mapping the site. So that took several years, and it took maybe 30 minutes with LiDAR. So, but that's the way it is. That's how technology advances.
But it helps to have that context that I walked every little segment of this site, mapping it that way. So when we got the LiDAR, I was able to identify everything that I had already seen in the LiDAR. So it's very useful. So we have these types of fortified sites all over the region. And so this is kind of the physical evidence for warfare. You could argue that when you see the warfare portrayed in the art, you could argue that maybe it's not an actual event. Maybe it's a symbolic representation of warfare. Maybe it didn't actually happen. But then we have the physical evidence on the ground that really shows us that there certainly was warfare at the time, with these very large walls here at a nearby site. And we see these sorts of fortified sites all over the region in the LiDAR study that we've done. We also have other physical evidence of warfare in the region at the site of Piedras Negras, which again is one of the major kingdoms in the region. And this was documented by the Penn Museum at the University of Pennsylvania that did the excavation back in the 30s. And they documented at Piedras Negras the throne room. So this is where the king would have received visitors. This is where he would have sat. This would have been where he made decisions about his kingdom. And so this is where the throne would have been. This is what the throne looks like today. You can see it in Guatemala City today, if you ever have the chance. Really a beautiful object. But when it was documented, discovered by archaeologists, it was discovered in pieces. So you can see these little fragments of the throne. That's the throne there, all of those. So it had been intentionally destroyed at some point. And they've now reconstructed it, of course. So the argument today, and there's been several theories here. So this is just the current theory. The current theory is that this was actually a battle that took place between Yaxchilan and Piedras Negras, and this was the target of the battle. So people from Yaxchilan traveled to Piedras Negras, attacked the site. They made it all the way into the palace. They likely captured the king, and they destroyed his throne. And we actually have a document recording this battle in the year 810. This is from the site of Yaxchilan. So this is near Piedras Negras. And this is essentially recording what happened. It said in 810, we captured the ruler of Piedras Negras. You can imagine what happened to him. And essentially that we went to the site and we defeated Piedras Negras. This is actually the last that we see of Piedras Negras in the written record. So we know that they didn't recover from this attack. And this is right around that collapse that we've talked about. So there is an aspect of warfare contributing to the collapse of Maya centers at this time. But also we can tell from this inscription, I don't know if you can tell, but we can tell that Yaxchilan wasn't doing very well either with this inscription, because this is a pretty messy inscription. It's sort of like if you say you have a name tag and you're trying to write your name and you run out of space, right? I'm sure this has happened to everybody. You kind of run out of space and then you have to squeeze in the rest of your name. That's kind of what happened here. So they started out pretty well, but you can see they ran out of space. So they didn't plan it very well. And this would have never happened 100 years before, right? So we can tell that there's something going on at Yaxchilan where the scribes are not as talented as they once were. There's certainly some aspect of a decline in their scribal system or their scribal schools at this time. And this is the inscription here that says the ruler of Piedras Negras was killed, essentially. So a lot of my work, I've also looked at the maps that we have of this region and tried to figure out what warfare would have been like. We have all this evidence for warfare. And one way that we can do this is we can look at travel times. So it's just like Google Maps. You can put in your destination. The math is a little bit more rigorous, but you put in your destination, your origin, and you basically figure out the fastest way to get somewhere. This is kind of what we're seeing here. So these are paths connecting different sites, but these are ideally sort of showing the distance that you could travel in a day. So you could travel this distance in a day, but it would be a really long day of walking. This is probably a more realistic day of travel. And this takes the topography into account as well. So that's why it's all sort of amorphous a little bit. But this kind of shows you that within a couple days, you could get to the edge of Piedras Negras, the Piedras Negras Kingdom's territory, and then you could start entering into the territory that we associate with Yaxchilan. And we do know. Oh, okay. we do know that these sites here would have been associated with Yaxchilan. So there is something going on here where we can certainly see that, at least in this case, the extent of a Maya kingdom at this time in this region might have been as far as you can get in a really long day's walk. And then you start getting into this region here. But for Yaxchilan to attack Piedras Negras, it would have been a very difficult journey. You would probably be fine once you get to here, more or less, but once you get there, you're in enemy territory, and it's really pretty miraculous that they made it all the way to Piedras Negras. So it's possible that the nature of warfare was changing at this time. We know that warfare was important. It's important to all societies in some way, but we know that among the Maya, warfare was something that was happening for millennia. And we know that it was a very important aspect of their political systems. But it seems that at least by this time, around the end of the 8th century AD to the beginning of the 9th century AD, that there may have been more of a type of warfare that was focused on the city centers, more so than perhaps in the past. We don't really know where battles took place in the past. It's possible that some battles would have taken place on neutral territory or at smaller centers like the site I worked at for my dissertation. It's likely that those were the focus of many battles. But at this time, we start to see that they were able to intrude all the way into the kingdom itself and get into the palace, which is really a pretty amazing feat. But we can see that it was not entirely successful, in the sense that Yaxchilan did not survive much longer than Piedras Negras. A Pyrrhic victory, however you would say it. So we've been continuing to work in this region, and I've started that new project that Phyllis mentioned in the Lower Lacantún. The Lower Lacantún is a river that feeds into the Usumacinta River, which is the border between Guatemala and Mexico. So these are some of the LiDAR data sets that we have. You can see they're very small. We got these in 2013. And these were actually recorded by NASA. So what they did was they just flew an airplane in just a single transect and came back like that. So that's why they're very thin. So very limited. But on top of that, we were able to contract another company to map this region. This was in 2019. And then we came back with drones, and we filled in some spots in 2019. And then in 2022, we got this. And then in 2023, we got this. So you can see we've got a lot, but there's still much more. It's going to take a really long time to map all of this area, and a lot of money, to be totally honest. But this is just to give you a sense of how much we can map with the LiDAR, but we're really just scratching the surface still. And this is the case with most of these LiDAR surveys that you're seeing. And I'm working down here, by the way. I don't have really any LiDAR there. We do have the drone that we used down there. So this is that site, Piedras Negras, where we saw the throne room had been destroyed. This is our LiDAR map of Piedras Negras. You might notice it's a little bit less detailed than some of the other ones I've shown you, because this is a very forested environment. This is a true rainforest. Many areas of the Maya region are more like what we see sort of in maybe the Fort Myers area, that sort of environment. So a true rainforest is really just in this kind of area. This is more of most of the Maya area is more like that savanna kind of tropical climate. So it's much harder for that LiDAR signal to penetrate the forest here, because it's denser, but we do have some of it. And we're able to look, this is the 1930s map, but again, was done mostly by hand. And you can see how it matches up really well with the LiDAR. And then this is the site that I've been working at more recently to the south. It's called Benemerito. It's not a well-known site. It's uninvestigated really until now. So it's not in the textbooks yet or anything, but it is a very interesting site. It's one of these large kingdoms, and we don't actually know what kingdom this was. We have some inscriptions, we have some monuments there, but they're very heavily eroded, so they're very difficult to read. But this is a kingdom that would have been on the scale of Piedras Negras. It would have been on the scale of Saksi. It would have been on the scale of Yaxchilan. So this is sort of like a missing, lost kingdom, you might say. It may be a kingdom. My theory is that there's a kingdom called Lakamtun, which is actually the same name as the river today. So it would make sense. That's kind of my theory, but that's another story. But this is the drone here that we used, and we were able to map this area here. This is that NASA flight that I mentioned. So that's the single transect there. And then we came back in 2019 with a drone and got this area here. This is the main site here on top of this landform. And so these are some of the details of the site. This is the architecture here. This is the palace up here to the north. The Acropolis, which basically just means the highest, most elevated part of the site, where the temples would have been. The main plaza here, and then the ball courts. It's significant this site has at least 4 ball courts. This would have been where the ball game was played, and the ball game was very significant to Mesoamerican cultures. 4 ball courts is pretty high for the region. Most sites have 1 or 2 ball courts. So that's one of the questions. Why are there so many ball courts here? It seems obviously very significant here. We've also documented additional hieroglyphic evidence. We excavated a couple years ago this hieroglyphic stairway, and we only documented 2 blocks. It's possible there's more if we were to excavate more. But we found these 2 blocks, and the inscription actually talks about how the lord of the site, Benemerito, the site that we don't know the name, probably somebody by the name of like Ta Chan Ak or something along those lines, that he actually played ball. He played the ball game with, of all people, the king of Tikal. So this is a pretty amazing inscription because we're not really near Tikal. We're a week away walking, perhaps, from Tikal. We're many days journey from Tikal. So it's really interesting that we have some evidence of the king of Tikal visiting this site and playing the ball game. And this is the ball court here. It's also one of the largest ball courts in the region. This is the preliminary drawing of the inscription. It's heavily eroded, so this is kind of tentative, but it's clearly mentioning the king of Tikal, which is the critical part. Down here, this is hard to see. This is kind of a 3D model that I made, but what we're seeing is actually, this is the head of a deity here. You might be able to see that's the eye and the nose, and he's sort of, so he kind of has his arm sticking out like that. You can see it. He might be flying. So he's facing this way, and he has his arm out like that. And then he's facing what looks like a snake. So there's like a snake head, or it would be like this, the snake head. So really amazing monument. We need to go back. We need to see if there's more of it that can shed light on what's going on here. So anyway, so I think I'm going to end with talking about the Maya collapse, just because we know it was a very significant event. And it's still a mystery in the sense that we don't really know, we haven't pinpointed exactly what caused it. But before we can pinpoint what caused it, we have to be able to explain what actually happened. So what happened was that at least in the southern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, we know that these kingdoms were largely abandoned. We know that in some cases, the royal dynasties collapsed. We know that the royal dynasties were not able to recover. And in some cases, the populations surrounding these cities left. They abandoned many of these cities. They may have gone up north, they may have gone elsewhere. But essentially, there's a real phenomenon here that we need to explain about what happened demographically to lead people to abandon these places. It did take maybe a century or more for people to fully abandon this area. So it wasn't a very sudden event, but it did take place over perhaps 100 to 200 years. We don't really know what happened. Warfare, I've talked about quite a bit, I think played a role. There's a sort of argument that overpopulation and deforestation, environmental degradation may have played a role. I concede that it's possible, but there isn't much evidence for it. We just don't have the evidence to support that. Drought, we have a lot of evidence for drought, and it's very likely that these mega droughts that didn't just happen 1 season or 2 seasons, but several seasons, that these mega droughts certainly affected populations in the south. But we know that Maya civilization recovered, it continued to the present day. It continued in a fluorescence in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula at sites like Chichen Itza, which is a fully post-classic site for the most part, so after the collapse, right around that year 1100 AD or so, probably at its height. After that, we know Mayapan was occupied into the 15th century, almost up until the Spanish conquest. And this is really the origin of the term Maya, the site of Mayapan that we still use today. And we, of course, know that Maya cultures today are very vibrant. We have very healthy, large populations of Maya people, particularly in the Guatemala highlands today, and a very vibrant culture to this day. So when we talk about a Maya collapse, when we talk about Maya history, we always have to remember that, that the Maya recovered. And the Maya faced many more devastating events in their histories that we don't have time to talk about today. The Spanish conquest, for example, they were able to survive that. The Guatemala Civil War, other conflicts in the region. So the Maya have persevered. They've been resilient throughout all of this history. So we definitely want to recognize that whenever we're talking about Maya history.
Thank you very much for a very thorough and knowledgeable. So questions. Wait till I bring you the microphone, please.
Is Lacantone newer and different spelling than Lacandone?
So it's the same origin of that name.
Okay.
So it's just like an example of, I guess, what you would call linguistic drift, just how a word can transform over time. So yeah, so the question was Lacamtun, if it's the same as Lacandon. And Lacandon are a modern group of Maya speakers who live around Bonampak, in fact. And they still live a kind of, up until recently, they still lived a fairly mobile way of life. Today, they're more settled, but they still inhabit parts of the sort of foothills of the Maya highlands in the region that I work. And so the term Lacamtun, literally in Mayan writing, means big stone. And so that word has shifted, and there's been linguistic drift that's now made Lacamtun become Lacan with an N instead of an M, Lacantun, and then become Lacandon. So it's all the same word. It's just kind of drifted.
I didn't see anything about domesticated animals or beasts of burden. Did they have these?
So that's a great question. They didn't have what we would call beasts of burden. They didn't have any kind of megafauna, because most of the megafauna in the Americas had gone extinct at the end of the last ice age. So they didn't really have any type of megafauna that they could domesticate. If you go to Peru and you go to the Andes, you see camelids, you see llamas, alpacas, but there were no surviving camelids in Mesoamerica. So they didn't have anything like that. They didn't have any sort of, I mean, they had wild pigs for sure. The only domesticated animals that they really had access to were dogs, and dogs they probably brought with them over the Bering Land Bridge, you know, which you heard about recently. The dogs were probably brought with them for the most part. They'd probably already been domesticated. And then that leaves turkeys, really. Turkeys were the only animal that they had domesticated.
I understand they also domesticated the Muscovy ducks,
Some ducks.
which are a curse to our nicely landscaped golf course pools and ponds.
Yeah, certain waterfowl, bees, even sort of honeybees, you could say. What else? Not a whole lot. That's about it. I mean, they had, so we know that Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, had a zoo. So he had animals. He even had bison in his zoo. That's the first place that Europeans saw bison. So Moctezuma had sort of tamed wild animals, but not domesticated in the true sense.
Did you ever read the book, The Ruins of Itzu Chicha? And that's in the Yucatan.
Who's the author?
I don't remember the author of this book, goes long time back, and there was a young man that walked all the Yucatan and saw so many of the Mayan ruins. And he walked through the woods. There was no Cozumel, nothing.
Mm.
And he remembers that they were dealing with chicle. They're harvesting the chicle, and then people were fighting about it and stealing and robbing each other. It was kind of an interesting book.
It's possible that Sylvanus Morley was one of the archaeologists there. Talbot
I-
Mahler
It's
was.
been a long time ago.
Yeah, but you mentioned the chicle, which is the original source of gum.
And
Um,
he survived only on eggs of the, what is his name? Forget.
Okay, couple of questions from the
I'll
back.
have to look into that. Yeah, thank you.
One moment.
Yes, I'm curious about the pyramids. Were they used as burial for the kings? And was there relationship, any connection with the Egyptian pyramids?
Sorry, I didn't see you. I was trying to see
Okay,
where you were.
here I am.
So yeah, were the pyramids funerary monuments? And I think the short answer is yes. Of course, it depends is the longer answer. I think some of them maybe not, but I think in general, most of the pyramids in the Maya area were funerary monuments. We know at Tikal, the main temples, which if you've seen the photos, like the ones I showed you, the two main temples facing each other, we know that the big temple, which is Temple 1, that was the tomb of the ruler Hasao Chankawil. And we know that the other one was the tomb of his wife. So pretty much anytime you dig into any kind of architecture, even a house, any type of architecture in the Maya area, you'll find a burial. So it was very customary for the Maya to bury their dead under their houses, right? And then the connection to Egypt, of course, in Egypt, we know that pyramids were also funerary monuments, but there's a lot of differences in terms of the style of the architecture, and even in terms of, in Egypt, basically most of the tombs that were placed in the pyramids were looted in antiquity. Whereas with the Maya, that really didn't happen. For whatever reason, the burials under Maya tombs were pretty well preserved until very recently. When
Did they
people started-
bury objects along with the kings?
Yeah, so that again, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it depends. There are some tombs that don't have much in the way of burial goods, but for the most part, most royal tombs were full of burial goods, usually with jade necklaces, projectile points, ceramics, painted ceramics. Bonampak, for example, that would be an example where they didn't have a lot of burial goods for whatever reason. There's a lot of different explanations for that. It's possible it's just a different custom, or it's possible that the people at Bonampak didn't have as much access to precious items, and they wanted to keep them rather than deposit them in a burial. So it varies, but for the most part, there were burial goods.
Thank you.
You know what the structure of the ball games was and what significance it had in their society?
Yeah, so the ball game, I don't want to answer every question with it depends, but the ball game evolved over time. And so just to be clear, we don't actually know how the ball game was played during the classic period, during the 8th century AD. We don't know exactly how it was played, but we do know similar games are played today, in particular in Sonora in Mexico. There's a type of ball game that's still played, and we know that game is very similar to volleyball or tennis, where you pass the ball back and forth. And we know that you're not supposed to touch the ball with your hands or your feet. So you're supposed to just use your torso and your hips. And we know that you pass the ball back and forth, and there's actually a line. It's not a net like in volleyball or tennis, but there is a line in the ground that is essentially where you pass the ball to the other team. And if you miss it, then the other team gets a point. So it's very much like volleyball or tennis. And then we know that later on, once we get into the period around Chichen Itza, they installed hoops on the sides. So they have these big stone rings. So we know that later on, an aspect of the ball game was like basketball, to get the ball through the hoop. But that was later on. That wasn't earlier on, they didn't have hoops. So that was an addition later on. And so it's very likely that if you got the ball through the hoop, you might get 2 points or more points. You know, like in basketball, if you
If you throw a free throw, you get a certain amount of points. If you throw a longer distance shot. And then the significance of it, we do know that there was a ritual significance to the ball game. And we know that many of the depictions of the ball game that we see are with rulers playing against captives. So we know that there was a performative type of ball game. There was probably a real kind of spectacle of a ball game, like as a sport, but there was also a performative one where we have the ruler playing against a captive. And often the captive would have been somebody who had been injured in battle. And so it would not have been much of a competition, and the king would have probably easily won. And at the end, the captive probably would have been sacrificed. So that's where you get that kind of legend that the loser of the ball game would be sacrificed. I don't think that was always the case, but certainly sometimes.
I think we have a few more minutes for questions. We had this one here.
You want to fight about it?
I don't.
We play volleyball. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is about the how he or she. Can you tell us about their power? I mean, were they a dictator, or did what they say went? Or can you give us an idea?
So that's a huge question, and it's still an area of research, right? So honestly, that's an area of research for me to really understand the actual power of the ruler. Because what we're seeing is these are monuments dedicated by the ruler. So the ruler is showing their power in a monument, but we don't actually know if it's literal. We don't know if they literally had the power that they're claiming. So it's a huge question. And little by little, hopefully we're filling that in. Now, in terms of being a dictator, I don't think that rulers had enough power or had armies that were large enough to enforce much of their power. I just don't think there was enough of a population to do that. But I would think authoritarian, and certainly it was a political system that was focused on an individual. And I think certainly they would have exercised a degree of authoritarianism. How successful they were at that is still a really open question.
Thank you for this. I'm wondering, the north-south facing structures that you said repeated in a number of places and might be connected with astronomical events or situations like the solstice and the equinoxes. Do you know what those events or situations were that they were representing in the structures?
Yeah, so I think absolutely that is one explanation for the axis of these settlements. I think there would have been a lot of factors. Certainly, the local topography, the local environment would have influenced certain orientations. For example, there's some sites that are oriented the same way as a river, for example, or as a mountain, right? So just the natural topography in a way can influence how a site is constructed. But I think with specifically these sites that are always linear and north-south, I think absolutely there's astronomical significance. And typically we always focus on these important days like the solstice, like the equinox, because these would have been critical days for agriculture, critical days for recognizing when days start to get longer, or when days start to get shorter. All those sorts of details are really significant to many cultures worldwide. So I think that's certainly the aspect. There's been a ton of work. It's not my area of expertise, but there's been a ton of work by Ivan Sprach. It's spelled Sprajc. It's an Eastern European name. I think he's Hungarian. Sprach, Sprajc, something like that. He was involved with the discovery of Otumtun recently. I know that you were talking about that, but he's done a lot of work recently. If you're interested in looking into that more, he goes into real detail that I'm not qualified to go into. There's someone else, Anthony Aveni, I think Aveni, who's written a lot about this as well. So if you're interested in the astronomical significance of some of these sites, they are the people to look at.
Oh,
Thank
we had
you.
a professor here at the university, Susan Milbraith, who
Mhm.
also was, that was her specialty. I tried to get her for this series of talks, but she says she's busy writing a book. Doesn't have time for that lecture.
The last time I was at Tikal, and I'm not sure just when it was, but on Temple One, on all the steps, mostly young people were sitting there reading that book by, was it Van Daniken?
Yeah.
About the relationship between Tikal and alien civilizations. So I think that increased the tourism at Tikal enormously.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's all fun. I view it as science fiction, right? I love science fiction,
Do
but
we have any
it's all, it's interesting.
I have a question. Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. This was very, very informative. And as all of these lectures have been, you made reference to the migration over the straits, which we've learned earlier. Recent research is showing that there was habitation in the northern and southern hemisphere that goes back perhaps to 20,000 years ago. And yet we're talking about here and in other lectures and our other sort of basic knowledge about the development of cultures and civilizations in this hemisphere is maybe back 1100 BC or 1200 BC with the Olmecs and so forth. There's a huge gap in the development of these cultures that are getting a lot of research, and maybe we'll find older ones sometime. But I'm wondering, we know about the Mayan civilization disappeared, or virtually disappeared, and that there were some causes for that, and you've mentioned that. But what was the catalyst for these more sophisticated, complex cultures emerging in Central America and Northern South America? Is there any indication that there was, like the Nile was obviously a catalyst to the development of Egyptian civilization, but is there such geographic or migratory migration of peoples that all of a sudden brought these people to create these incredible appearance of these incredible civilizations or cultures in Central and South America?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a huge question.
Yes, I know.
So the earliest evidence we have in the Maya area, and when I say Maya area, I mean the lowland part of the Yucatan Peninsula. So the area that I was talking and focusing on mostly, in the Maya lowland area, the earliest human settlement we find is about 8,000 years old.
Okay.
And that's not to say that there isn't older evidence, we just haven't found it. So this evidence of people in the Americas 20,000 years ago, I believe it, and I would push it even more than that. I wouldn't be surprised if we find older evidence. But in terms of what we have in the Maya area, as of yet, we only have about until 8,000 years ago. So there is that huge gap, and that's an area that we really need to focus on. The problem is that archaeologists really like to study the Maya, but the Maya were a very visible culture. So we can see a pyramid even without LiDAR, right? The LiDAR helps. Even without LiDAR, we can see a pyramid and we can go work there. And it's a very visible thing for us to work on. The people who were there 12,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, they didn't leave anything that was really visible until you actually excavate and go really deep. And so we're just we're not digging in the right place to find that. So that's the main issue. In terms of where we have the origins of civilization, you might hear about when Gabriel Prieto comes to talk about his work in Peru, you may hear about the Norte Chico civilization, which is probably the oldest civilization in the Americas in Peru. And a lot of these oldest civilizations, like you said, they evolve or they develop in these alluvial landscapes. They evolve in these river valleys like the Nile. So with the Olmec, it's an area, it's in a lot of ways like the Tigris and Euphrates. We have the Coatzacoalcos River. It's a huge alluvial plain. It's a delta that feeds into the Gulf Coast. So it's really the perfect place. It's where you would expect a civilization to emerge. And then on the Pacific coast, where we have other older civilizations, anytime we have a coastal area, when we have people with access to marine resources, that can help them develop the surplus that they need to have a more stratified society, a more sedentary society. So I think those are two of the most important factors of why we see civilization develop where we do. And certainly environmental change plays a factor, right? There's drying periods, there's wet periods, and those certainly influence what can be grown in a certain region, where people can live, where large societies can develop. I think those are all factors.
They're
thank
finding
you.
things in the Amazon now. and that
Thank you
is
very much. We
oh,
have another program starting at 3 o'clock, so I think we have to call this to an end. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to come.